LDComics is a women-led, welcoming to all forum run by creators. We champion the graphic novel form, particularly works with an autobiographical voice. Our activity is towards supporting and equipping graphic novelists, especially but not exclusively people identifying as women. Established in 2009 by Sarah Lightman and Nicola Streeton as Ladies Do Comics, today LDComics is run by a committee of 6 published graphic novelists: Charlotte Bailey, Rachel Ball, Emma Burleigh, Lou Crosby, Wallace Eates and Nicola Streeton. From the start, the core of LDC's activity has been the monthly meetings, hosting presentations from invited guests to a public audience in a welcoming atmosphere for networking and making friends. The introduction of LDC online monthlies aims to replicate the joy and stimulation of our physical meetups. Everyone is welcome.
Starters, I'm Dominique Duong. I'm an illustrator and comic artist. I'm based in London. And yeah, I'll just be giving a talk about like my work and sort of where it all comes from. So like some examples to start off with, I've done a lot of different things, like everything from like sort of sci-fi to autobio to non-fiction, like Death Is Not the End. It was a short comic I did on how we can make death more eco-friendly. And this one on the right, that's a chapter illustration I did for the graphic novel, The First Verse by Dunby Kim. It's about like sort of post-apocalypse and how like global warming has sort of destroyed the world. So sort of like linked together as well. But I did the illustrations and the comic work for that. And another couple of examples, One for Sorrow, Two for Joy is a short comic I did for the Come Together comic anthology for European artists around the theme of reunion. It was about the Chinese myth of God and immortal sort of separated, and they can only meet once per year along a magpie bridge. And so this was about their reunion. Then there's also one of the more recent works I've done, Last Call. I did the artwork for that, but it's written by Emily Reisbeck. And it's set in ancient Greece. It's for the Nectar anthology, a comic anthology, and which is for like sort of trans feminine and trans women. And it's a story about these Greek galley priests, and set in ancient Greece. They were sort of like male at birth, but they wore feminine clothing and had feminine presentation. And this was about them discovering like a pot of ambrosia and the sort of transformative effect it had on them. So when I was growing up, I read a lot of manga, I watched a lot of anime, which I'm sure like a lot of people here can relate to that as well, and how it's influenced them. Like definitely style-wise, like anime and manga influenced me a lot. Like I really like the art style and then like the stories as well. And this is my sort of first foray into comics, like especially like Tsubasa, like the works by Clamp or Full Metal Alchemist. Like with Full Metal Alchemist, I really like that sort of epic scope of the story, and but still having those sort of warm, touching, like human moments, but the relationships and everything, as well as like Arakawa's like unique designs for all of the characters. So these were all really formative to me growing up. But I didn't really get into Western comics until like I was about 18, 19. Like my impression of them until then was sort of either like B&O and Dandy or like Marvel and DC superhero stuff, which I wasn't that interested in. But yeah, so I was a big fan of Neil Gaiman and his writing, and so that sort of led me to the Sandman comics he did. And this was sort of my gateway into Western style comics, because I loved the Sandman so much, this sort of dark fairy tale story. And it was not something I expected like to see in Western style comics, but it really opened my eyes to how like comics isn't like defined by culture or genre or anything, but it can really be anything you want it to be. And although when I first started out like in artwork, I wasn't in doing comics. I wanted to be a concept artist. And originally I did work for like a mobile game studio doing like concept art, 2D animation and that sort of thing. So this is kind of an example of what I used to do, which is quite different. But like I'd always been reading comics even then. And as I worked in mobile games, I kind of realized that it wasn't really for me after all, like being a concept artist, that I was more interested in telling stories and such, and like working my own things. And also I think animation in 3D also wasn't quite for me either. But this was just sort of an example of the kind of work I used to do. And after I stopped working at the mobile game studio, I decided to move more into illustration and comics. And I was sort of struggling with the transition from that, because like with the mobile game studio, I lost my job there because they were cutting roles basically. And I was making that transition to trying to work freelance whilst also sort of working part-time. But I was struggling a bit with like the transition from working full-time to being at home a lot of the time, and then also with the idea, I guess, of success and what I wanted my career to be, and all these sort of negative emotions came up. And to sort of deal with that, I was like making these sketches, like these sort of conceptual illustrations to sort of try and like let these negative emotions out, the sort of like depression and anxiety and worry over like my future and my career and all of that. And then I made these sketches into these illustrations, to sort of, again, let the emotions out and to like it was a sort of catharsis really. And like I had at this point like enough of the illustrations, I collected them together to make this zine, The Black Cloud, and I self-published it myself. And yeah, it was just like, it was the first time I self-published anything, and it kind of introduced me more into the world of like indie press and small press, and I kind of got me into the idea of making comics more for myself and everything. And then the next work I did, I think, was The Truth of Being Bi, which is like an autobio one about sort of me coming to terms with my sexuality as a bisexual person, and like how I sort of got to that point. It was originally created as an entry for like the Jonathan Cape Prize, and also at this comic residency I did in Southend-on-Sea. And it was my first time doing like any sort of autobio comic. Like I've been reading a lot of them, and this was my first time really attempting it. And it was definitely an interesting experience, because like me as a person, I'm not normally very comfortable like drawing myself or writing about myself, because I'm usually more comfortable like with fiction, like made up characters and such. But in the fact that I was kind of uncomfortable to write about, I guess it was also interesting because it was pushing me out of my comfort zone, like, and having to like write something true and also about myself. And then the next work I did was the Flower Maiden. Like again, this is another comic for an anthology, a horror comic anthology for female artists. And so this is also like my own story as well, like my own fictional story. And it was about this sort of character that I came up with in my university days, the Flower Maiden, and like a sort of ghost-like creature. And she like, sort of steals the life force of young women to sort of feed her life, her and her own beauty as well. And the story was about that, one of her making this bargain with one of her victims and then eventually stealing her life. And I feel like all of the comics I've shown so far, like the style's been quite different. It's evolved in different ways.
I just want to pause you for a moment, because somebody's making a lot of noise. So I'm just going to mute everybody and then ask you to unmute yourself again.
Okay. Yeah.
So can everybody who's listening make sure they are muted?
Yeah, I think it's in the background of Dom. Have you got?
Oh, it might be. Okay. Anyway, I think we're good now. So yeah, Dom, if you want to unmute yourself, and yeah, if there is any noise, it's possibly in Dom's background, so we can't do much.
Sorry about that. Like I'll try and make sure I speak up and everything. But yeah, so this was like a horror comic I did it fully traditional as well, so like inking, like watercolor and gouache as well, just to sort of like, because I was still kind of figuring out like what style I wanted to do and how I wanted it, like my art to look. So it's all like very in development and everything. But I can't, for this like sort of Victorian England sort of story, like a traditional look kind of felt in keeping with time period. So that's what I went with this one. And then the next one I'm going to talk about is like one of the most recent like comic that I've like self-published and done for myself is The Dog and the Cat. With this story, it was originally, again, like a pitch for a comic anthology about mythology in the modern day. So for those unfamiliar with it, the Chinese zodiac, it was a story where there's 12 animals and they go in a race for a swimming race down the river to decide which order the animals would go in the zodiac, who would go first. And in the story, the rat wins by jumping on the ox and then waiting till the end and then jumping onto the riverbank. And then so the rat became first. But a lesser known story related to it was the story of the cat. Like the cat and the rat used to be friends and they were very close. But on the day of the race, the rat let the cat sleep in. And so the cat missed the race completely. And this is why the cat hates the rat. And they're always like, it's always hunting the rat. And I kind of wanted to take this lesser known story because there've been lots of stories about the Chinese zodiac itself and make the cat the main character. And the story, like The Dog and the Cat, is about how the cat is dealing with the sort of aftermath of this betrayal and the resulting like issues with trust, and how the dog, which is another animal from the Chinese zodiac, like approaches the cat. And they come to this sort of agreement to meet up every year for like Chinese New Year's dinner. And the story is about the developing relationship between the dog and the cat, and how the cat has to overcome these sort of trust issues, and in order to like have any sort of positive relationship. And as well as that, it's a queer love story as well. And I guess it's all sort of about the sort of the fear of being known and like making yourself open to vulnerability and to change. And I'm like half Chinese as well, so it draws like the story it's very close to my culture and also like close to me personally. I took a lot of inspiration from that, and then also I mean, it's about a story where they're meeting every year for like Chinese New Year's dinner. So it's also about my love for Chinese food as well, because like I love food, cooking, and I've grown up eating this food, and it's so much a part of myself and part of my culture. I could not imagine like not having grown up with this. And so it's like a love, like the story is very much a love letter to my Chinese culture, like Chinese New Year, like Chinese food and cooking, as well as like a literal love story. And so these were like the initial sort of thumbnails for the story. Like they're very rough and everything, like especially because they were only done for myself rather than like an actual editor. So like they're quite rough, but it was just to sort of show you like where it started from, and then where I went with like finished art. Like this was concept art I did to sort of work out the characters and how they express themselves, and like how they work like in the character design in terms of consistency. And like this was the dog, and the previous one was the cat as well. And this is just sort of work out the characters and what they would be like. And then these were the sort of like completed pages. Like I'm not very confident as a colorist, I would say. But this one, like I went through a few different iterations, but ultimately I decided this wouldn't really work as a black and white comic, because just for like sort of it's a love story, so the tonal feel of it, and then also like because a lot of it's like focusing on food and such. And I felt that the sort of appealing aspect of the food wasn't going to come across as well in black and white as it would in color. So I opted for this sort of like monochrome pink colored comic, like pink for the love story as well, which might be a bit of cliche, but I felt it worked for the story. And then also just for this, like, because pink seems like a soft color to me, and soft and warm, and like warm feelings as well, which I felt matched the mood and mood quite well. And yeah, the story just sort of details like the dog and cat's relationship as it like develops, like from conflict initially to sort of gradual understanding over the years, and eventually it blossoms into like a romance when the cat finally has the courage to sort of speak her feelings and take that step to making herself vulnerable and opening herself up. And so this was like very much a passion project for me that I did during the lockdown as well. And although it started off as an anthology project, well, the anthology was like dropped, but in the end, like I wanted to continue the story for myself because it had like so much of myself and what I love in it as well. And so that concludes the talk from me.